Namaskar and welcome to this special program. The Quad is not a military alliance like NATO. It's a grouping that seeks a free, open, secure, prosperous Indo-Pacific anchored in democratic values. And it's going about that by strengthening the security of sea routes, helping in post-COVID economic and financial recovery, and making the region future ready in terms of climate change mitigation and critical technology supply chains. Our topic today is free, open, secure, prosperous Indo-Pacific. And we have an eminent panel to discuss this. Let me introduce you them. Professor Harsh V. Pant is Director, Studies and Head of Strategic Studies Program at Observer Research Foundation. He holds a joint appointment with the Department of Defense Studies and King's India Institute as Professor of International Relations at King's College London. He's also a visiting professor at several institutes in India and abroad. Professor Pant's current research is focused on Asia security issues. He has written several books on India's foreign policy. He writes extensively in columns for leading Indian and international journals. He's done his master's and MPhil from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and his PhD from the University of Notre Dame, USA. Professor Sachin Chaturvedi is Director General at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS. His areas of expertise relate to development economics, development finance, SDGs, South-South cooperation, apart from trade, investment, and innovation linkages, with special focus on WTO. He's a member of the Board of Governors of the Reserve Bank of India. Professor Sachin Chaturvedi has been part of several important initiatives of the Government of India and takes keen interest in transforming economic policy towards integrated and evidence-based approaches. He's one of the foremost commentators on India's external sector economic engagements. He has authored and edited more than 20 books. He's on the editorial board of several journals for both India and abroad. His key area of interest is South-South cooperation. He's done his PhD in economics from B.R. Ambedkar University, Agra, and his postdoctorate from Yale University, USA. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. Professor Pant, let me start with you. So the Quad has been working to strengthen vaccine production in India, procurement and distribution. And the aim is to get the Indo-Pacific past the pandemic, also to revive growth. This, in a sense, is a vaccine for the economy of the region. What would you say?
Yes, absolutely. I think the issue here is that, if you are looking at the four major powers in the region, coming to work together, as you described, for an open, free and inclusive region, Indo-Pacific. That is, then one of the foremost priorities at the moment is to revive the economic infrastructure in the region. The economic underpinnings in the region coming from the COVID-19 crisis are very vulnerable. And of course, the health and the wealth crisis that the world faces, at the center of which stands the Indo-Pacific, I think it's imperative for these four nations to come together and do something about it. So when the first leaders summit, I think it's also heartening to see that one of the most practical and practicable steps that has come out of this engagement of the leaders is to ensure that the health underpinnings of the region once again retain vibrancy, so that the economic revival of the region takes place. Because until that happens, we will be in this midway somewhere between yes, revival is happening, but we are not so sure it would happen because the health crisis is still not under control. And vaccines therefore play an important role. India alone cannot deliver. And therefore, now that we are working together, the four nations are working together, the attempt is to leverage each other's strengths. And in that particular context, this particular initiative is very welcome and very timely, and would play a very important role in reviving the economic underpinnings in the Indo-Pacific and perhaps beyond.
Professor Chaturvedi, the Quad has reaffirmed its strong support for ASEAN's unity as well as centrality of the ASEAN outlook, the ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So there is, of course, this the BRI, which is creating debt traps in the Indo-Pacific, and regional development has been the key motive, in a sense, of the ASEAN. What do you think? I mean, regional development is key, and the Quad is looking at regional development as well?
Absolutely, Mark. If you look at the broad dimensions, the emphasis is on localization of development. of creating local capabilities, local employment assurance, and also trying to keep countries out of huge debt burden that they're ending up with, not just by borrowing money for infrastructure projects, but also by import dependence. India's recent development experience with Atmanirbhar Bharat, India's experience in terms of offloading huge import dependence on China, reducing it from 16 to 19 billion dollars in last 8 months is a case in point. So India's emphasis is based on India's own experience, and India is very much keen that the Quad countries bring forward this alternate development narrative, which is emphatic in terms of how this localization would happen. The idea of last mile connectivity in vaccine that Harsh mentioned is also important in terms of how you ensure local capabilities. So this emphasis is very much about localization, about local capacity and local resources and leveraging that in the region. It's very important that both Australia and Japan have now made up their mind and have come on the table of doing away with this huge dominance that we saw in the past, where they couldn't make up their mind, but now we are sure that they are clear in terms of how to go forward in the region.
And Professor Pant, would you see the ASEAN looking towards the Quad for regional infrastructure projects? Because there are definitely more options are in the regional's interest, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that's where perhaps Quad has made or it will be able to make its mark, because it's, a lot of the discussion is whether you are for or against China and what it does to China. Yeah. But I think what the Quad member states perhaps are trying to do is something more substantive, which is to give smaller economies, smaller countries in the region alternatives both in terms of the development paradigms, as Sachin was mentioning, but also in terms of practical options of where do you get infrastructure financing, for example. How do you make it possible? If in the end all you are left with going to Beijing and saying, look, you are the only alternative, please help us, then that undercuts the real purpose of the regional integration and a balanced economic approach to the region. So what I think Quad member states are beginning to shape up is an alternative paradigm where perhaps there are alternatives available to smaller nations, there are alternatives available to ASEAN, and of course for all of these four powers, India, Japan, Australia and America, ASEAN centrality had been at the core of their Indo-Pacific vision. So there is no, there is no contradiction there that we want to create a free and open inclusive Indo-Pacific, at the heart of which sits ASEAN, where perhaps all the smaller countries, all the countries that are, that make Indo-Pacific possible will be able to go and leverage alternatives, will be able to go and leverage respective strengths of various developmental partners, and will not have to rely on a single partner like China, which at times can be extremely coercive and bullying. And therefore that changes the dynamic in the region in and of itself. You really don't have to shout from the rooftop that this is about China. It becomes it becomes organic, an organic process, a bottom-up process, where countries will be able to leverage alternatives, where countries would have alternatives, and therefore a new paradigm would automatically come in front of us.
Professor Chaturvedi, the pandemic has definitely caused financial problems, and there is a need to improve the resilience of supply chains. Can the Quad provide these options? I mean, we also know that the US DFC, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, the Japan Bank of International Cooperation, Australia, all are willing to finance. So there's money that's available.
Absolutely right, Mark. And as Dr. Pant rightly said, the idea is, and if you look at the statement that is issued, the spirit of Quad, I think it brings out very clearly that it's not, as you rightly said, is not just Indo-Pacific NATO. It brings out scope for cooperation in wide range of areas. If you look at the vaccine implementation, the climate change, the critical and emerging technologies, even in the areas like maritime security and also climate change, countries have limited resources to cope up. Post-pandemic, the economies, the GDPs have gone through a contraction. Even in Q3, we saw them struggling, and Q4 was disastrous for most of the economies in the region. At this point, vaccination program itself is extremely expensive for them, and good that India has stepped it up. And the fact that India could reach out to more than 70 countries with Indian vaccines has given the leeway for this new proposal that the spirit of Quad has identified. Japan and US both have agreed to support the Hyderabad-based biological that company to roll out J&J's vaccine. Australia would provide the logistics support. So this advantage, not just of a triangular, but in a way a quadrangle support program for getting vaccine not only at affordable prices, but in several cases free of cost to several people is something which is what India stands for in terms of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So that idea, that spirit, that central spirit of India's foreign policy is very much a manifestation of this initiative that is so much evident as part of an inclusive Indo-Pacific that we have been talking about. And I think, again, Dr. Pant is right in terms of referring to the centrality of ASEAN to this development initiative when it comes to vaccination program. The statement is absolutely clear in terms of identifying Southeast Asia and Pacific Island countries as the ultimate beneficiaries of this initiative. So it's very well defined in terms of what centrality of ASEAN would mean when we explore cooperation programs in these wide areas of cooperation.
True. And the Quad countries too, Professor Pant, they want to increase their trade with the ASEAN countries and other countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So it's, it's not just that one is trying to break their dependence on China. It's strengthening these economies, also strengthens the supply chain from them. We know that Australia wants to, increase its trading in this region. Japan has had some security challenges, and they want the trade routes to be better. Of course, the US, because it's a huge power, it has to play a role, and it would be in its interests to see that trade routes are kept active. It's in the regional interest, it's in the US's interest, and of course, India is a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region, as well as the vaccine Maitri has given India a lot of goodwill. So all in all, I mean, how would you assess the goodwill of Quad itself in this region?
I think this is a very important time for a platform like Quad. We have, when we used to talk of Quad, say a year or so back, most of the discussion used to be in the geopolitical or geostrategic paradigm. Mm-hmm. Today, we are moving into a dimension of geoeconomics, where I think geoeconomics is going to centrally define what Quad is eventually able to do, and how receptive other countries are to this idea of Quad. And that's why I think that the initial statement, the joint statement, has been quite encouraging, because it talks of a range of issues where we are looking at the region more holistically, not simply from one perspective. And that creates these opportunities. You are right. All the major powers are looking at reducing their dependence on one particular state. There is certainly that change that has come about in the last few years. You would recall one of the first statements that Prime Minister Modi made was, when he said that one of the biggest lessons of COVID has been about self-reliance. And what he was basically saying, and there's a misunderstanding whether it means protectionism, autarky, etc. in India. It basically means that India wants to enhance its capacities to a point where it becomes an important player in the restructuring of global supply chains. That's basically it. And if that happens, then you can look at India's role in a very different light. Then you can look at, for example, the whole debate that Australians are having about what do they do if Chinese are the only player in town buying up their rare earth metals or critical sector minerals. Where are the other players in the market? And I think if you start looking at the supply chains from a different perspective, if you start restructuring them for whatever reasons, if you start a process, America had started a process of gradually of a strategic decoupling, you are looking at a paradigm shift in the economic perspective of the world and of the Indo-Pacific. And that's where when Quad says, well, we are looking at, as Professor Chaturvedi mentioned, in terms of localization, local capacity buildings, it can have important ramifications for the entire global economic order. And there, Quad perhaps will have to play a very, very important role, not only for its own credibility, but also for the larger strategic stability of the Indo-Pacific, where a lot of the questions are today a mix between politics and economics, and therefore geopolitics and geoeconomics have to be considered together when we are looking at the ramifications of what it means to be a member of Quad today and its operational consequences for the region.
Professor Chaturvedi, it's the paradigm is shifted because also climate change is a huge factor, and mitigation of climate change, technologies that are required for that, low emission technologies. This is what the supply chain should be filled with to a large extent. So in this respect, there's a shift that there's an economic shift that's also likely to take place in the supply of goods and services. And would you see the Quad playing a role here?
No, definitely. In fact, Mark, if you take a step back and recall Prime Minister Modi's visit to London when he attended the Commonwealth Summit, his one point was that India and UK should work together for Pacific Island countries to enable them to cope up with climate change. How the small island developing countries can be supported, particularly in Indo-Pacific, where they require new technologies with the rising level of water and losing out on areas where they are growing nutritious products across the island. So how you retain biodiversity, how you retain their continued dependence on agriculture and provide them options for livelihood security. And this is one intent with which India has started discussions not only among the Commonwealth countries, including with the UK, but also in the Quad. And this statement is absolutely clear in terms of what the intentions are. So I think it is extrapolation of what we saw in case of Commonwealth, what we saw in case of India-Japan statement on FOIP, and now the Quad has also reflected that. So this should not be viewed as any kind of regimentization against China, as Dr. Pant rightly pointed out. This is our collective commitment for development of everyone and not leaving anyone behind. This is very much the idea Prime Minister Modi has been talking about since 2014 of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. This is very much about that. And this is important to point out here that it is getting manifested through initiatives where so many global actors are involved. It's not just Quad alone. It is also bringing in many other actors. You see similar spirit, Mark, coming out from Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA, where IORA is also very keen to play a similar role of bringing the whole of Indo-Pacific together. So I think it's a time to realize the wider development vision that Prime Minister Modi has brought out, and Quad in terms of its immediate relevance has identified that as an area where we have to go collectively together. It's also important here to note that President Biden has also seen this as the stepping stone for his administration to come in Indo-Pacific with this kind of joint statement that has come out. So I think, in my view, it has several symbolic importance.
Indeed, and one of the concerns also, Professor Pant, is with regard to future technologies, because we're already out in the digital age, and we know how these technologies, there is a security architecture that is a concern. So I mean, it's going to play a greater and greater role in the future, and cooperation to find the best kind of principles of technology design, development, technology standards. All this sort of setting the rules in a sense so that technology cannot be misused. So that it can be used for subversive activities in the future. This is an area where, I mean, the stronger powers can actually play a sort of equalizing or balancing role. Professor Pant.
Yeah, I think, the role of critical technologies, the
Yes.
role, which is one of the most important issue areas where the four countries have been talking about, both in terms of their participation, as well as in terms of where they want to take the discourse and the policy conversation, is very important, partly because when you're looking at the next stage of the global order evolution, when you're looking at the next stage of economic, fourth industrial revolution, for example, it is on the basis of these critical technologies that we are going to estimate where we are going. And the geopolitical contestation, a large part of that geopolitical contestation is happening in that space of critical and emerging technologies. So, I mean, at the end of at the end of the day, what we are looking at is a fragmentation in the global order. At one point, we thought that, look, technological cooperation or trade cooperation is going to make the world united. But today we are talking of greater fragmentation, where we are willing to trade only with those countries with which we are more comfortable with. So like-minded countries trading and developing technologies together. London's UK's proposal of D10, for example, that democracy should come together and develop the next stage of 5G technologies. I mean, all of that is there is an underlying churn in the technological component of our conversations. And for these countries, for these major powers, that is very important, because again, you don't want to be in a position where another country, another power which has different value system added to its agenda comes to dominate this sector. And therefore, leveraging each other's strengths once again becomes a priority, which the four major powers are seen at this point will more than ever perhaps willing to do, and to contribute to the larger evolution of these technologies for the larger regional and global good, which I think is again a difference from, say, certain other countries which have been more unilateral, which have been more mercantilist in the development of these technologies and the use of these technologies for geopolitical purposes. And I think that's a clear differentiation here that perhaps needs to be made between those powers that are now willing to come together and work together for the global good and global governance, and those countries which are willing to use technologies, emerging technologies, for geopolitical purposes. And I think if that distinction is understood, I think a lot of the Quad conversation perhaps becomes more comprehensible.
Indeed. And Professor Chaturvedi, what would you like to say about this? Because, I mean, I see that, even in the joint statement, there's a lot of reference to these critical technologies, and they've even broken them down. There's the national technology standards bodies to be working with a broad range of partners. There is cooperation with private sectors and industry, future telecommunications, telecommunications deployment, diversification, equipment suppliers, monitor trends and opportunities related to development of critical technologies, emerging technologies, biotechnologies. I mean, they're working on a whole range of issues. How crucial is this? How important is this in the entire conversation?
Mark, for last couple of years, world is realizing the importance of governance of technology, and governance of technologies from three different perspectives. Critical and emerging technologies are also going through a trend where you find convergence of technologies. You see how nanotechnology, information communication technology, and biotechnology, the three frontier technologies, how they are converging at a point to give you products. And these are raising huge challenges in terms of ethics, the ethics of technology, how you bring in ethical regimes to govern technologies. And here again, if I can point out the violations that have happened in countries as big as China, where non-ethical interventions in bioengineering with human species have been done. It was way back in 2001 when we collectively decided, after Human Genome Project was completed, not to get into human genomics without a wider global understanding on this issue. Almost a moratorium came up, but 2 years back, you heard of China coming out with synthetic babies. So synthetic biology and its governance, the ethical dimensions of it, they require huge attention. The second important point here is of AEI, access, equity, and inclusion, the trends that we see in technology, how you do that. And the third component that Dr. Pant mentioned is in terms of the security dominance. the fact that 5G is one which is over-encompassing led Germany, Japan, and US to come up with cable-based 5G intervention. So you require technology governance from these
Absolutely.
wider perspectives. And I think Quad has done fantastically well to allude to this and bring that back on the agenda that G20
Right.
also is trying to address.
One question that arises, Professor Pant, from the strategic domain is that India is a member of forums like SCO, BRICS, RIC, and some analysts will look at these, as would maybe affecting India's interests in Quad. What would you think? I mean, are they entirely separate? How do they both serve India's national interests?
India's perhaps response for a long time has been, and many people, even in the past, this issue had come up, even before this virtual summit happened. And India's response has been quite straightforward that, look, we are living in a very fluid environment and we need partnerships on all issue areas. And we are no longer in the business of non-alignment. We are aligning on the basis of issues. So I think that there has been a shift in India's position on alignments, on engagements, on partnerships, where partnerships have become a means of strengthening India's bargaining positions. And certainly, when you look at some of these platforms like RIC or BRICS or SCO, they have, either a regional focus or an issue-specific focus. Whereas when you look at Quad at the moment, Quad is more or less a platform looking at the entire Indo-Pacific. India, for its part, would like to be present at all platforms. And wherever Indian interests are concerned, they may be in Central Asia, so India would like to be in SCO. They would be on global governance and multilateral shifts. Right. Therefore, BRICS has been important. But India will stand up for its own interests wherever it is needed.
A final word from you, Professor Chaturvedi. Our topic is free, open, secure, prosperous Indo-Pacific. Trade routes are vital in this region for the entire world, in a sense. So what do you think? I mean, the Quad will be a net provider of not only security, but will be a generator of economic revival in the region.
Absolutely right. You require governance of oceans, and Quad has been concerned about it. The sea lanes that are there, the global public goods that are there, the biological resource base that is there in oceans. The trade routes are fine. Their revival, the post-pandemic shrinkage of GDP that we are seeing, it both have to go hand in hand. The security dimension, the unnecessary dominance that we saw in the past of the sea lanes, they all have to be addressed. So I think Quad has given Philip to both the protection, the security, but also the prosperity in the region and free choices for those who are willing to import from different destinations. So this, I think, is extremely important. And what we discussed just now in terms of the variety of choices that countries have to be sort of exposed to and assured in terms of sticking by their choices and preferences, I think is absolutely important.
And with that, we conclude this discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Harsh Pant and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, for being with us here in this discussion. And thank you very much for watching. Namaskar.
जल्दी करो यार, प्लीज जल्दी।
दूसरा कोई मैच है क्या?
ऐसा ही कुछ है यार।